Welcome to the Conversation Lab. I'm Don Schaefer. We live at a time where every conversation has the potential to devolve into an argument where we can't speak to one another, and where even the most trivial of issues have someone fighting passionately for or against something. We are more polarized and more divided than any other time in history. I think it was John Dewey who said, if democracy begins in conversation, then we need to nurture a culture where ordinary people like us routinely talk about those things that help us understand each other, whether about climate, race, religion, gender, sex, or politics. I saw a post recently for an SFU course called the Radical Democracy Summer School. I immediately signed up for it. If there was ever a time we needed some radical democracy, it's right now. Stuart Poyntz is the director of the School of Communication and a director of the Community Engaged Research Center, or CERi, at Simon Fraser University. His work on participatory research has largely involved teenagers in informal learning spaces and art institutes. Johanna Ashworth is a researcher, educational planner, and filmmaker. She's a researcher associate with CERi, the Community Engaged Research Initiative at SFU. She founded and directed the professional programs and partnerships in the Faculty of Environment at SFU. I'd like to thank you both for taking time to join us and talk about this program. Before we start, so we could get to know you a little bit better, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you do and why you do it?
Joanna,
would you like to go? Okay, sure. Well, I'm currently and have been at Simon Fraser University for, I think it's on 20 plus years. I started there as a director of the dialogue programs at the WAS Center for Dialogue, and have been involved with the Center for Sustainable Community Development over the years, where I taught for many years in the certificate and diploma programs. So I'm really deeply interested in sustainability and in how to bring more people into that conversation. And that led me to work in the Faculty of Environment, where I ran a number of professional programs for planners and others who work in environmental fields and who are wanting to stay current, and spend a lot of time looking at issues around energy transitions and green infrastructure. And along the way, developed a number of community partnerships and projects, and was fortunate in that time to have run into Stuart Poyntz, who is a colleague and the director of the School of Communication at SFU. And we've been, he invited me to join as a research associate the Community Engaged Research Initiative, which he co-leads, and where I have also been wearing a hat over the last year or so. And that's where I landed. Part of my work has been involved with this research project, Participedia, which is a global network of researchers who are looking at innovations in democratic practices. And our interests, Stuart and my interests, have coincided. And that's led us to the formation of a proposal to Participedia to host a summer school through CERi, the Community Engaged Research Initiative, and Participedia. So that's my short history. And I just spent a lot of time in Latin America before I joined the university, working in development projects, and really enjoyed my time with NGOs and the UN in the World Food Program. So that's a bit of my history.
So what calls you, or what called you to the work you do?
I think I've always been a kind of an organizer and someone who likes to support people in their learning projects. And that goes way back to, I think, when I was in high school. And I became a researcher really early in my university days. I was lucky to work for the Park Board and do some research on, what it is that different constituents of the parks wanted and needed. And so I was just really curious about how much you can learn from asking people what it is they need. I think that really goes back to sort of basic, democratic practices of how do you engage and support people to see a vision of themselves and look for something that might improve their lives, and do that in a collaborative way.
It's also a beautiful question. Stuart?
Let me start by saying that the thing that motivates the story I'm going to tell you is a long-term interest I've come to realize in how people begin to see themselves as political subjects who have the capacity to respond to relationships that are bearing on them. And I know that can seem like a highly general sense, but for a lot of young people in particular, which are the communities that I've worked with over, 25 years now, and young meaning folks between, about 13 and 25, the capacity to see themselves as a citizen, which is a formal description in our country, doesn't necessarily translate into everyday life contexts. And I have long been interested in how a whole host of alternative communities generate that subjectivity and then mobilize communities to respond to their situations from a perspective that's often outside of formal democratic politics, that often sees formal democratic politics as dubious or unrepresentative, and is engaged in the work of mobilizing and organizing and generating action from other places and other positions in society. And that's led me, this is as an academic, as a researcher, this is my second career, Don. I spent a decade working in nonprofit worlds and art communities, and have a real interest in how art communities offer, particularly where media production is concerned, which art and media production have woven together as aesthetic and cultural work, how those kinds of spaces offer a kind of home and a launch point for people to orient themselves to worlds that they feel ill at ease in, and often have experienced, either they or their families or their communities have experienced real positions of deprivation. And art can provide a nourishing quality, but also a deeply meaningful space of regeneration that allows people to then act out and respond to the world from a place of confidence and a certain degree of collectivity. That work, I spent a decade at a film institute, the Cinematheque in Vancouver, and that work took me all over the country with traveling digital production studios before we had that technology attached to our bodies so regularly through our mobile phones now. And that was wonderful work in the early 2000s, I would say, late 90s, early 2000s. I then turned to do research on that work and have, did a PhD, ended up getting hired in the School of Communication at SFU, and I'm the director and a professor in the school now, and have done a lot of work over the years in media literacy and alternative forms of political community building. And it's led most recently to a study of art communities in cities around the world that bring young people into political spaces. And this book's called Youth Sites. It is reflective of the kind of work we do at the Community Engaged Research Center, where we're trying to work with communities through research to find ways to respond to their needs, but also mobilize a sense of power and position to act on those needs. And that can be at the level of policy, that can be at the level of mobilization and gathering of social movements, that can be at the level of influencing public institutions like universities. And all of those speak to thematics that the school in radical democracy captures. I think where Johanna and I have come together is around issues of organizing, but also efforts to expand concerns of democratization to multiple kinds of communities and sites, and to allow those sites to breathe with a kind of richness of action. And right now, this includes responding to climate crisis and democracy deficits, but it also includes responding to other kinds of social crises, including the drug poisoning crisis that is around us. I'll leave it there, Don. I could say more about stuff that has come together through this work, but that'll get us started.
Thanks, Stuart and Johanna, for those introductions. Can you explain what the Radical Democracy Summer School is?
Johanna?
Oh, sure. Well, in short, it's a full week of intensive, interactive, informed, engaging conversation about a number of themes that we've kind of assembled around the idea of radical democracy. And those themes include, exploring the theories, obviously, of democracy and what it means to be radically democratic. It explores our own lived experiences of democracy. And as Stuart was saying, many people do not really relate to the concept, or let alone the practice of democracy, even though we're living in liberal democracy, we often feel quite alienated from that. So we're exploring the lived experiences of participants of many different constituencies that maybe don't feel well represented or included in the conversations of things that are affecting them. We're looking at power and disruption. I think power is a very important dimension of when we talk about radical democracy. What are we talking about in terms of power? The building of power, the taking of power, the using of power, coercion, the sharing of power, but also of disruption. Because we often think about, if you're a radical Democrat, well, you're all into disruption. You're into turning things on its head, and there is an element of that, but we certainly see it as much more than that. And so the other themes, creativity and futurity, is really about how can we bring an artist's perspective to the way we think about creating change, intervening in systems, allowing people to see what's happening in their in the areas of concern that they have, and how can we have a vision of a different kind of setting, whether it's very local, hyper local, something in a neighborhood like a safety concern, or a garbage concern, or something bigger in a region like the care of a regional water system, transportation systems. There's all kinds of scales, but what we want to look at is where we can be more creative and think more about the future that we want for these different sites, and working with artists and artists who are also scholars and practitioners. Like, what are people doing on the ground? I think one of my favorite images, being at the climate change conference in Paris in 2015, there were incredible pieces of art there that really were very moving, like big chunks of ice that over the course of the 2 weeks were melting, so you can sort of get this visceral feeling of the drips of water, and as we were, in our discussions, we could see this ice disappearing. And also there's a great statue in Berlin of all these policymakers are up to their necks in water, while they're discussing what needs to be done. But I think there's some powerful ways that art at that scale, but art, in people's lives that can actually help them express and understand their options and their possibilities. We're going to spend a lot of time on cases in which we look at the democratic forms of agency, the ways that people have made change. And I think there's a lot to learn from the lessons that we do know, the cases of people that have come together in collective action and done something and are doing something. And I think that we need to understand that. We also need to know how to research those. I mean, we are, for the most part, a group of researchers and practice oriented, of course, but definitely want to understand what is the best way to study some of these cases and these situations that are often way ahead of the theory, in a sense. People are often much further ahead than we are able to theorize about it. And so what are some really also creative methods for researching deliberative and radical democratic practices? And we also want to pay attention to, I think it's a very strong notion and probably overlooked when we talk about radical democracy, and that is the notion of care. Relationality, inclusion, and of course, decolonization. We're bringing those together because the scholars that are going to be talking about those dimensions of radical democracy, one is an Indigenous scholar, Kathy Walker from the University of Saskatchewan, and I'm really excited to meet her and to hear more about her work with Saskatchewan farmers and the decolonizing work that they're doing with Indigenous communities in Saskatchewan. That's centering relationality. And I think that's like turning radical democracy in some ways on its head. And of course, the final day looks at democracy and ecology and this notion of the common. And when we think about the common, how does that change the way we think about economics and our place in capitalism and in economics? And then we're going to bring it together with a really engaging set of presentations and a kind of gallery walk of designs that people are going to come up with in the course of the week, in which they're going to bring their sort of creative thinking into a specific problem or an area of shared concern, and how they might bring some of these theories and practices into being and kind of test it out and share it with the other colleagues. So that's a full week, and it's going to be, there's also field trips, there's going to be other special seminars, there's going to be an evening event. We hope there's going to be a lot of talks over beer, or coffee, and just a real meeting of minds and a building of community. That's kind of the nutshell of what we're doing.
Stuart, anything you want to add?
I just want to jump in on some of the things that, and Johanna's provided a really lovely lay of the land, but I think what's important to understand about what the School of Radical Democracy is it's really building on an element of proliferation around democratic practices. And the context for this school and for this work is really a series of case studies of hundreds of participatory democracy practices around the world that open up and expand our understanding of what democratic action looks like, where it happens, and who participants are in it. I think asking the question about what is a school of radical democracy about raises a question about our assumptions around democratic practice. And I think many of those are located in pretty formal acts of democracy like voting. And I think what pulls together some of the thematics that Johanna shared a moment ago is the sense that democracy in the context of everyday life is a multi-layered kind of practice that happens in many places and often in response to questions, struggles over power that are not being reconciled, that are not being addressed. So I think one of the elements of the school that's really important is this sense of a proliferation of kinds of democratic practice and agency in multiple sites across societies where critical issues of concern to populations are at stake, and those kinds of actions that are emerging. Another element of radical democracy that I want to highlight is that it takes account of the fact that there are critiques of democracy that are alive, and that there has been a real move around a proliferation of authoritarian anti-democracy kinds of practices and national configurations that need to be addressed and taken on directly. And so the School of Radical Democracy is not only looking at this everyday world of democratic operation, but the way democratic struggle at the level of societies is changing and taking shape today, and being contested by deeply anti-democratic movements.
Who is the Radical Democracy Summer School for?
That's a great question. Well, we have a number of graduate students from across the country and some from the global south that are joining us. So they're coming as grad students in different disciplines. The course itself is housed in the School of Communication. So it's a communication graduate level 5-credit course for those of those students that are coming as sort of grad students more formally for credit, and coming from different disciplines. But we're also seeing a real interest from people who are community leaders, who are policymakers, who are artists, who are, independent researchers or consultants, or we call deliberative practitioners. I think for many who have signed up, it's kind of, they see the invitation or the information on the website, and then they go, this is something I have to do. And so we've had that response from many people. There's also a huge, Stuart talked about Participedia and the web platform that houses all of these different cases and methods and organizations who are doing really innovative work in democratic participation. There's a network of more than 40 researchers around the world, and many of them have grad students working with them. So we're seeing some of those grad students coming to, particularly working in this area, who are going to be joining us as well. Yeah, so I think it's for whoever this program resonates. And I think, you kind of know it when you see it. There's something that maybe is missing if you're a community organizer, but your frame is not sort of radical democratic politics. Maybe this is a different way to frame what you're doing and think more broadly about both the theories of radical democracy and all the contested ideas and the complexity and the not sort of fixed nature of radical democracy. Then you might be called to want to expand your thinking and your toolkit, because there's a very practical kind of hands-on approach that we're taking as well. So I'm hoping your audience is going to have the same reaction that you did, Don, to this offering.
So I learned about the Radical Democracy Summer School from a friend. I'm guessing the best way to learn more about it is online?
Well, if you go to our website, on the CERi website at Simon Fraser University, CERi, CERi, and put in, just Google Radical Democracy Summer School, you can look at the syllabus, you can look at who the faculty are, you can look at all the themes and the readings, and then you can go to the link if you're a community leader, you're in a union, you're policymaker, your elected official. There are different ways you can register directly. You don't have to be a formal student to be able to access this, but we ask you to share a little bit about your background and sort of what moves you to attend. So you can do it for non-credit, and you can do it for credit. The window for applying for the credit side is swiftly closing. We're open for non-credit till the 15th of May.
This radio program and podcast is called The Conversation Lab. I'm Don Schaefer, and today we're speaking with Stuart Poyntz and Johanna Ashworth, who are putting together a course called the Radical Democracy Summer School at SFU. I know you've talked about this, but I want to go back and unpack how you bring radical democracy and art together.
I think, Don, part of what we're trying to get at in thinking about this as a school of radical democracy is what Chantal Mouffe and other scholars like the philosopher Hannah Arendt talk about as the power of agonism. And I think in both cases, in both Mouffe and Arendt, and what many of your listeners might recognize is that the draw to confront, to engage, to appear and address the matters of common concern that we are faced with as a society is in and of itself a democratic act. And that really begins the work of democratic mobilization. And that's not only a set of actions, but an identity, a way of seeing oneself as part of a social world that one can shape, but is also responsible for, and has a certain role in engaging and opening up. And so in flagging this term radical democracy, part of what our effort in the school is, beyond trying to draw attention to practices around the world and communities around the world, is to try to address the fact that democracy doesn't only happen on infrequent occasions when we're called together to cast our opinion or vote. That democracy is a way of living. And as a way of living, it calls upon us to have a kind of collective orientation to the world. That matters right now in a time in the I don't want to say the aftermath of COVID, but I do want to say in the waning days of the COVID pandemic. One of the legacies of this time is the difficulty we have now coming out of this pandemic of coming back together, returning to the work of collective gathering and collective action and collective motivation. And questions of radical democracy really bring those demands and those concerns and those actions into view. Focusing on art, creative practice is a modality for allowing that connective sense of belonging to begin to happen, whether it's through representations that we share, work that's exhibited to tell a story about a world and a set of traumas, injustices that are happening, or ways of coming together to show possible futures. Creativity and art practice are a way to both register meaning and establish collective meaning together in a way that allows a future orientation. And so I want to say that the School of Radical Democracy is not only pulling open this question of what does democratic practice demand of us, but also offering alternative ways of becoming involved in that work that some of your listeners may find encouraging, exciting, bring energy rather than merely responsibility to the table. And that's certainly some of the dynamics that we're trying to bring attention to and open up at the school.
Johanna, anything you want to add to what Stuart said?
Would just say that, when we talk about radical democracy, I mean, there's an umbrella, an assembly of ideas there. But I guess the main one for me is that it's this idea of a rooted, what is a more rooted democracy? What is it to go back to the root of what democracy is? Now, of course, we could say going back to the root of democracy, the seed of democracy in ancient Greece, yes, that was the birth of democracy, but was it the kind of democracy that we're going for? Not necessarily, because there were only certain, there wasn't a lot of difference in that, the public square in those days. There was a lot of exclusion of the population. And I think we're moving to deeper, deepening democracy, greater inclusion, recognition and appreciation for difference, addressing inequality, addressing justice. Those are sort of the fundamental values, I think, that we're sort of holding democracy to account. I think when we look at it from a radical frame, it's not about necessarily breaking things down. It's about returning to what we espouse. What are the values that being truly democratic are the foundation. And so I think it's more a radical democracy, I think, is better conceived as a project, that's always evolving and never ending. It's not something that we're going to get to, but it's something that we kind of demand of ourselves and others, that we can do better. And there's certainly, it's full of tensions. And I think that it's the tensions that we want to explore. It's the complexity that we want to explore. And I think we'll do that in many ways throughout the program by looking at specific cases and saying, how does this story reflect the use of power? How does this particular story of change reflect the use of creativity? How does it get us to imagine a different future? What is the future that they're going for? What is the future that they attain through their use of power? So, what is a level of care and inclusion that's part of this story? So we've got, there are a lot of stories to tell and a lot of lived experiences to unpack, but using a kind of a set of lenses around what it means to be deeply radical, deeply inclusive, deeply centered on justice and equality. If those things aren't important, I don't know what is. But it's funny how, as Stuart pointed out at the very beginning of this conversation, that most of us don't really think about democracy on a daily basis. But I think this is an opportunity. You don't have to be a political scientist to pay attention to and see the value of some of the theories that really open up your understanding of what's possible and unpack the complexities of the way we're living, especially around tensions, the polarization of thought and practice in the public sphere right now. It's probably more pronounced, but not necessarily the first time we've had a polarization in our societies. How do we approach it? And if we're not deeply holding on to a democratic frame amidst the fallout that we're going to be experiencing around climate change and all the other kinds of crises that are out there, if we don't hold on to those values and those practices, then will it be the tyrants and the bullies that get to decide? And that's something I think we need to pay attention to.
I'm quite struck by that. It reminds me of Toni Morrison's article, No Place for Self-Pity, No Room for Fear, where she talks about dictators and tyrants who routinely begin their reigns and sustain their power with the deliberate and calculated destruction of art. I'm also thinking about Chris Hedges and Frantz Fanon, who just want to burn it down. So how do we deal with that? How do we find a place to meet in the middle?
I find those sentiments really interesting today, Don. And I mean, the question about political revolution and disruption is present with us in so many different locations today. I think we're on the cusp or the edge. We feel this kind of sense of disruption. And whether it's a consequence of the climate crisis and climate disaster that befalls us, whether it's a consequence of profound kind of injustices that we see emerging and exploding into violence, often on the bodies of the same communities, African Canadians, African Americans, Indigenous people again and again, the bodies of women in particular, you have some sense of why this sense of anger and disruption is in the air. I do want to acknowledge, though, in Fanon's recognition of the need for violence, there's also the strong sense we must acknowledge that we've seen when political violence emerges in this way that it's often the most vulnerable and already damaged members of society that then become brutalized again and again and again. And it's not necessarily a redemptive act. And so the need to hold on to elements of civility that allow us to protect against the most brutal forms of violence seems to be something we cannot ignore, particularly as we see a wash of violence break out in civil wars around the world right now. And I mean, we may talk about Sudan, we may talk about the war in Ukraine, but we could talk about many sites of violence that are present. And in those contexts, it's often the most vulnerable members of societies that again and again experience that violence. So the quick turn to political revolution needs to be cautioned against, given the record that has posed in the past, which is not the same as defending a liberal standard of democracy. And I think one of the claims the school will make is, what does it mean to both critique a liberal democratic model of democracy and at the same time caution against the too easy turn to political revolution that promises a kind of out of control violence that has the capacity to reproduce patterns of power and brutality. What does that space in between there mean as what we have in the past called social democratic revolution, forms of citizen-led transformation, that require new kinds of bodies to gather in and organize around, that may not lead to the kind of revolutionary action that we've identified with things like the Soviet Revolution and such in the past. This is complicated ground, but I just want to caution against too easily moving to one extreme or the other.
I like Michael Ignatieff's take on this. In an article he wrote in The Walrus, he asks if we should ready ourselves for revolutionary politics, or if revolution isn't the answer, and we don't want to throw away the wisdom we've gained from our experience of other historical emergencies, what would a non-revolutionary climate-conscious politics look like?
Can I know Johanna's got lots to say, but I want to just respond to Ignatieff and say, I think one of the routes forward are forms of citizen collectives. Worker councils is what we used to talk about in the wave of the Hungarian Revolution in the 1950s, where workers' councils as counters to formal political parties and revolutionary parties were often seen as ways of maximizing democratic engagement and experience across different areas of societies, that disavows the concentration of power in a singular party, but recognizes the need for new kinds of gatherings and formations of citizen action. I think citizen councils around, for instance, participatory budgeting are examples of those kinds of developments that you see emerging today, with efforts to find other routes to participatory democratic futures that recognize limits of liberal democracy, but don't move to a kind of vanguard political party either as the other alternative, which seems to me to be a very dangerous pattern marked by devastation in history, as Ignatieff points to. Johanna?
I would just add, this idea of political violence, and I don't think it's for us to say, if you've been oppressed and beaten down, is violence a legitimate response? Well, I don't think that's for us to say for people who have been brutalized for years and, want to be free from that violence. But I think in Canada, for example, when we look at Indigenous decolonization, and what's required and the radical transformation of the state and all the processes involved, it's mostly a rejection, I think, of Fanon's argument about physical violence. I think Indigenous people, and especially the Indigenous scholars that whose work we're familiar with, they look at a relational revolution as in a way that's a transformation of the way we relate to each other in the world, which I think is really it's inviting, and it's a place I think that most of us want to be. And to use violence as an answer to violence is not going to necessarily get us the effect that we want anyway. So burning it down, like you said, Don, like, can we burn it? Do we need to burn it down? But maybe we redefine what it means to burn something down. Maybe we think more ecologically that, creative destruction actually brings new growth. And, how do we do that in a way that is relational, that is, brings people along instead of simply destroying what is. But the conversations on power how to wield power, how to build power, how to share it, I think are vitally important. And some of the tools that Stuart just mentioned, some of the methods for bringing people together, even who have very different and often violently conflicting views, some of these methods can actually hold those differences and help people work through them in a civil way. So I'm hopeful around what we can learn about what people are actually doing on the ground and how we can actually apply that in other situations and towards other challenges.
One of your strands is about deliberative democracy and relies on enhancing the public exchange of reasons to deepen democracy. Your second strand speaks to how we can mobilize democratic power, and I'm curious what both of those look like.
I think another element, as Johanna and I were preparing for our discussion today, Don, we were thinking about the larger context of capitalism that is part of the space, environment, the context of crisis, where these issues about deliberative democracy and an expansion of democratic activity happens, and a reality that work needs to encounter and respond to. And if I may, I just want to say that I think what's fascinating about this question of deliberative democracy now is we're seeing in the aftermath of COVID a recognition that what seemed impossible in 2015, 2016 to many, the sense that a social disruption with capitalism in 2015, 2016 seemed almost unimaginable to so many, inconceivable, really. And I think one of the legacies that COVID has left with us is the sense, actually, as 2020 and 2021 to a lesser extent made quite present to us, that we can, as a society, make decisions on how to transition to a different kind of social reality and social order. I'm not in any way, in saying that, suggesting that that's about to happen or we're on the cusp of that change. All I want to say is that for a generation of young people coming of age into the kind of political community Johanna and I are identifying, they have come of age in a time where, for the first instance in many decades, a sense of a kind of dislocation of capitalism, a transition in the way capitalism as a system of economic development operates, is perhaps conceivable, is perhaps something that people can begin wrestling with around the edges, around imagining a different horizon than what I might call the absolute legitimacy of capitalism that has lived on in the West over the last 30 years. And I think we're at a point where I have a 23-year-old son, and I look at a generation of young people who are coming of age at a time when certain kinds of social crises have been so present that the need to think systematically around our socioeconomic system is also in the cards now. And I see that as quite an exciting set of possibilities which allow deliberative democracy to hold sway across relationships that they would have been excluded from perhaps in the past. So I say this as a matter of identifying a cusp, a horizon that I feel like we're moving through at the present moment, that the Radical Democracy School aims to kind of activate and pivot around.
I'll just jump in and add to that, Stuart, because I think having this Dion Coe, who's a head of research for solid state industries in CERi, is a great example of an organization that is trying to change the economic model of how do you do business, and this is a project, an initiative that supports young people from communities of color, BIPOC communities that are looking for ways to make a living and to do it in a way that gives them some sense of control over their economic life. And so they're building co-ops and they're doing them all sorts of really interesting things. So we're going to spend time looking at how that works and how that fits into these other notions of economics and supporting the generation of new entrepreneurs, but doing it in a way that is sustainable, that is relational, and that also allows people to make a decent living.
The more I hear you and Stuart talk about this course, the more excited I get. It would appear I'm I'm not alone. Can you talk about who's joining you on this program?
That is so exciting. We've got a really interesting collection of people who are both community leaders and scholars, as well as some of the leading scholars in these ideas from around the country, from around the network of Participedia particularly. I'll just say Kathy Walker, I mentioned her earlier, from the University of Saskatchewan, is an young Indigenous scholar. Kara Peacock is an emerging scholar who's going to talk about Idle No More and the research that she's done on social movements. Justin Langlois is an artist and educator and associate professor at Emily Carr, and has done a lot of, I want to say, arts-based kind of community engagement, but it's that probably doesn't properly describe his work. Astra Taylor, who's a filmmaker and has directed the film called What is Democracy, is going to join us in some of the pre-work that we're going to do. Young scholars from the Participedia Network, like Etienne Cardan Trudeau from University of Toronto, and Antonin Webster, who's doing his PhD in political science at UBC. Both are going to do, I think, an amazing job at getting us started on this conversation on power. Genevieve Fuji-Johnson is a political scientist from SFU who's done so much. I think we could call her a community engaged scholar, a deliberative democracy scholar. She's doing work with sex workers and in decolonization. She's just like a very powerful thinker. And the director of Participedia, Bonnie Ibawa, is coming, and he's a human rights and restorative justice specialist. And it's just going to be an incredibly rich conversation. The list goes on, and you can see the full list of bios people who are going to be leading parts of the school, also on our project website. So
I think what Johanna has just outlined for your listeners, Dawn, by naming and registering the range of people, is going back to your earlier question about who is the school for. I think that the group of artists, academic researchers, community researchers who we've assembled for the school represents in some ways the target audience for the school as well. These are people who are artists and democratic actors, democratic leaders, not only in a North American context, but an international context, in the case of both Astra Taylor and Bonnie Ibawa in different ways. Genevieve Fuji-Johnson does work across a number of different communities, including sex worker communities, Indigenous communities, and so on. These are people who bring together the nonprofit world, community activists, social movement actors, and researchers. And that is in many ways who we see as the audience for the school at the same time. So I'll just conclude on that.
That's an incredible roster of talent, which gives me hope. And hope always reminds me of Rebecca Solnit, where she writes, "Hope is not a lottery ticket you can sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. It's an axe you break down doors with in an emergency. Hope should shove you out the door because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war and the annihilation of the earth's treasures and the grinding down of the poor and the marginal. To hope is to give yourself to the future, and that commitment to the future is what makes the present inhabitable." I think it's this program and the faculty and the activists you've assembled that give us the instruction we need to use that axe.
Well, Don, it's never too late to radicalize democracy. Let me just say that. I think that's the message that we want to explore. It's the idea we want to explore. What does it mean to have, I think it was the Oscar-winning movie, Everywhere, All at Once. And it's kind of the same thing. We think that to be a truly radical democratic society is to have democracy flourishing at all scales, everywhere, all at once.
Stuart, anything you want to add?
I would say for those people who are cautious about the fit of the school for them, please know that we very much design this for different kinds of participation and different entry points into the school and the kinds of conversations that we're going to have. And when I note that we're aiming to reach a mix of audience and a diversity of publics, that's very much about how the program, the activities, the dialogue sessions themselves have been designed. So I say that as much as to alleviate concerns folks might have about fit, but also to invite folks from across different communities to join us for this program.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the fact that we're not grading anyone in this program, even those people who are taking the course for credit, it's not a graded scenario. It's about participation and about contribution and, really the passion for learning and asking good questions and getting into really in-depth conversations. So that's, I think, accessible to everyone. And we really want to practice democracy in the classroom too. We want to find ways for people to self-govern, to self-organize, to feel like all their voices matter. So we'll really be attentive to that and we have some ideas about how we can kind of jumpstart that at the beginning of the program.
That'll be fun to watch and be part of.
Yeah. I really hope you sign up, Don.
No, I wouldn't miss it. I'm looking forward to it. And for anyone who can't attend the class, the syllabus, which is on the SFU website, is incredibly helpful and has some terrific resources. So I want to thank you both for joining us and heartfelt thanks for taking the time and the care to put together such an amazing program.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, Don.
Stuart. Thanks, Stuart.
Take care, everyone.
We've been talking with Stuart Poyntz and Johanna Ashworth about the Radical Democracy Summer School at SFU. So whether you're a student, faculty, activist, or changemaker, you can learn more about this program doing a search for Radical Democracy Summer School at SFU. That's another edition of the Conversation Lab. This radio program and podcast is produced by CFRO-FM, or Co-op Radio in Vancouver's downtown Eastside, on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. Our gratitude and thanks to them and the many not-for-profit organizations and community groups for their support. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider becoming a member of Co-op Radio to help support programs like these and the hundreds of volunteers who make this program and others possible. If you know anyone or an organization with a story to share, please let them know about us. We can be found at coopradio.org, theconversationlab.ca, and on many social media and podcasting platforms. This episode was cobbled together with some help and inspiration from Kimit Sekon, Julian Anton, and Ann Watson. Thanks, guys, and thanks for coming by. I'm Don Schaefer.